Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you for being here on a Friday evening and spending time with us. We really appreciate that. David talked about a slide where he said he would have spent 45 minutes talking about it. My entire objective for the next 20-25 minutes is to tell you the story of how we got there. I'll try to summarize that as much as I can. A lot to cover, but the amount of time being given is pretty little, as usual. I want to start off with something that I was doing about a few years ago. Way back in 2018, I was working with a company in Japan. And the task we were given is basically plan out a strategy for 5 years, 6 years, and 7 years. And they wanted to figure out how they will be able to transform the technology, especially on the claims and the policy management. So we did that. You can imagine how that would have turned out. This is 2018, so we're talking about now what could have been. We predicted this 2018. And I think basically everything we predicted was wrong. Things have changed completely different than what we expected it to be. Historically, even very recently, organizations have been thinking about doing long-term planning. I think the word long-term and the definition of the long-term has completely changed. It has moved from years to months, if not weeks. Now, I did a presentation at AWS a month ago, and I had a slide where I wanted to talk about what has transformed in this quarter. And I wanted to pick that slide up and use that here, but I realized that it has already changed again. I had to recreate that slide. So I'm going to just talk about what things have changed in the last couple of months, and then use that as a basis for me to go through for the rest of the presentation. Let's talk about models. Now, this is basically what's happened in the last 3 to 4 weeks. We have realized GPT-5 has come, which is kind of, every model that comes in is on the top of the leaderboard according to them, but GPT-5 is pretty phenomenal. Finally, GPT and OpenAI released open source models, staying true to the term open. And they have a 120 billion parameter model and a 20 billion parameter model, which does a pretty decent job. Just yesterday, DeepSeek released 3.1, which actually we've started testing, and it's phenomenal. X has released Grok 4. We had Claude Opus 4.1, Sonnet, yada, yada, yada. And the numbers keep on growing. It's just the amount of information that's coming in with these kind of models and the way we are actually starting to look at how this changes the way we do business, way our customers do business, and how technology is transforming is significant. The Gemma 270 million parameter model is quite interesting. That's the smallest model Google has released. And now we can start thinking about edge computing eventually. These models are pretty decent. They're not obviously as good as the big models, but the ability for you to be able to fit this on your devices and take it with you wherever you go, and that's going to be transforming edge computing quite a bit and bringing LLMs to the edge computing. So that's one part of the war. This is, I would say, the war of models. Then for the developers in the room or anybody who's been closely associated with how we are actually building AI, there is a war of IDEs as well. We've obviously heard about Visual Studio Code, but things have changed. Now, Windsurf was a product that was built in about 2 years, and eventually OpenAI proposed that they will buy that. They dropped it. My guess is Microsoft kind of twisted their arm saying, don't want to compete with VS Code. But then what happened was Google and Devin kind of picked up all the developers and made their pretty much organization strong, and Windsurf went out of the window. Amazon released Kore. They also see a significant amount of opportunity here. Now they want to go completely vibe coding, and they built an editor called Kore. That's in the market. We're testing it. It's okay. The Cursor is a IDE for some of you guys who probably use it on a daily basis. They changed their pricing model, and suddenly they start bleeding customers. And finally, Claude Code released about a couple of months ago, let's say 1.5 months, 2 months ago. And it was a CLI model, which basically is not using IDI, and it's kind of killing the way we actually do coding and build stuff. We don't want IDA anymore. We go back to the old days of CLI. So that's the war of IDEs. Then there is war of browsers coming in. Perplexity has released something called Comet, which is fundamentally an agentic-based browser. We know that OpenAI and Anthropic are both fighting for another browser, guessing they would come up with pretty soon. But you can see the trend that from the brain to completely capturing your entire operating system, that's the transformation we are seeing happening. On one side, it was just the brain with the models. Then we got into the IDEs where pretty much you kind of tapped into the developers. Eventually, you went into the browsers, and I'm guessing that some point in time very soon, you'll have the operating systems fundamentally driven by agentic capability, which means that every device will be ready for you to use with agents in place. Now, what this is, the entire reason why all of this is accelerating is fundamentally because we think AI is a form of leverage. And that kind of accelerates everything you're trying to do. And I want to just take an example to kind of level set this. I'm probably guessing that some of you guys have used deep research, whether it is coming via OpenAI, Grok, Google, etc. Now, if you go back just about a year and a half ago, and if you wanted to create a report, let's say you want to understand a particular industry, figure out what's happening, what's your competition, and create a report around that, our typical approach would have been that you start with data stores. If you have access to things like Gartner, Forrester, you go get the download of the reports. You probably go to Google, find out various different type of information, extract those websites, and then you start building on top of it. You're consolidating this data. You're trying to understand what this data really means, synthesizing that, and finally say, okay, this is my story. I'm going to go and present to my customers, my management, whatever. So the amount of time you would have spent in making this happen is probably days, if not weeks. Now shift to today, it's a prompt. What has happened is what was technology was giving you access to where the information was, now does the whole aspect of synthesizing, consolidating, and giving you a piece of information that's ready for you to use. And the only thing you have to build on top of that is a story you want to narrate either to your management or to your customers. Now this is about 10x leverage because the prompt to getting that entire report is probably less than 20 minutes that you would have probably spent days and weeks for you to actually generate them. Now, the story part is still with you right now. Maybe it's tomorrow when you want to actually build a story, the models will be able to do it themselves. So what we are seeing is a trend that is moving from a simple rule-based automation to completely full autonomous systems. Now, this trend and this spectrum of change is happening slowly and steadily. We're already in the middle somewhere. And I think the ability for you to be able to execute fully autonomous capabilities is already there. The question is, where in the organization would you want to apply today, and how do you want to experiment with them? Now, let's go back and look at how we have evolved in this entire journey. Because as an organization, we've been around for a decade now. And our entire focus has been in terms of building the conversational AI experiences. Now, the conversational AI experiences was basically the core of what Kore did, with the foundational of the pieces of enterprise. So we were being battle tested with the enterprises. We have checked in long checklists of what we need to do. How do we actually ensure security? What are the different type of information we would need to go if you have to go with big enterprises and make sure our products are able to run at scale with them. And obviously, we had all the capabilities of text and voice-based automation on top of it. What we realized was we wanted to figure out how do we actually move from this to the agentic world. Back in 2022, we were experimenting with GPT-2 actually, and models called FLAN T5 way before ChatGPT came in. Today we can actually define the world as BC and AC, before ChatGPT and after ChatGPT, and that became the spectrum upon which you actually evaluated how things were. So before ChatGPT for us was all looking at these LLMs and see how they can be incorporated into an NLP engine that we had already built in. Then after ChatGPT, we realized that we had to really accelerate all of this. And we were naive enough to initially think that we wanted to build a foundational model ourselves. And very we quickly realized that's a bad idea because we saw open source models come out and we realized that models are going to become a commodity eventually. And we have to stay true to what we are, enabling capabilities of platform and no code that our customers can use to build and automate their own systems and operations. So what we wanted to do then was look at exactly what we're really good at. We have spent decades in terms of building the platform capabilities for enterprise readiness, where we know exactly what needs to be done. We have understood and looked at all the checklists. We've been vetted by various different customers, and we said, okay, we are ready to use that part of our capabilities. Now the objective was, how do you take the top part, which is only conversational, and really start moving towards agentic AI capability on top of it? And that is the focus of what has been for us for the last 2 years. And I'm going to just briefly touch upon how we've evolved over these, and that should explain what are the kind of features we actually brought into the platform itself. The first and foremost was we started working with models very early. But if you really think about it, prompts have become the specifications of today. Historically, we used to write specifications, whether it is about business vision, whether it was about product specification, etc. Now we are kind of moving away. Internally also, we moved up from the concept of SDLC to what we call AI-driven development lifecycle, which is fundamentally everything driven by AI in every aspect of our development, our thinking, and as well as brainstorming. And if you start thinking about that, then prompts become the source of what you actually do. They become the specs. So when we started thinking about this 2-3 years ago, really, we said, okay, we need to be able to look at various different models and figure out a way to create comprehensive prompts, first manually, and then auto-generate that with other models to make sure they're able to execute what they're supposed to do. So we built this prompt studio, which enables you to do AI A/B testing with multiple models. We spent a significant amount of time experimenting with the various different type of prompts, built over 60 plus prompts, and we continue to improve that, which will be a plug and play for various different use cases. We also realized very quickly that because prompts are specs, you have to also have a life cycle around it, which means you should be able to build and version them, use them across various different products, because what we saw and what we saw with our customers also, the prompts were embedded into different applications, hard-coded. So we wanted to build that out and make complete life cycle around that. And that's where we focus significantly for the first few months within our agentic journey. Then things started to change. We started seeing a significant adoption of RAG-based, retrieval augmented generation-based capabilities within the organizations. This was kind of the first step where generative AI became pretty mainstream in most enterprises. And then we said, okay, at that point of time, we had to figure out how do we actually bring in this capability into our tool stack. So we started working on what we call Search AI, which essentially is the ability for you to connect to various different structured and unstructured data within your organization, bring that pieces of information, make that available through embeddings, and we built several different connectors that can connect to typical enterprise applications and outside of those, and then support various different vector databases. So behind the scenes, when you're able to look for an information, we are able to then tap into the Search AI capability, look for both structured and unstructured data, and then bring that piece of information, show it to you. Initial days, it was pretty rudimentary. Then we realized that when you look at complex documents, when you start working with big financial industries, we realized that documents are not as simple as you send a PDF file which had 10 paragraphs. We saw complex documents with images, with charts, and we had to come up with mechanisms for us to import all of the data, extract it out into embeddings so that you're able to get the information you're looking for very, very quickly. So we spent a significant amount of time kind of optimizing this entire Search AI experience. Some basic Search AI, we have what we call Agentic RAG, which is agentic-based Search AI capabilities. That was the second bit. Then we started to see influence of processes being automated with AI. At the very beginning, it was moving from deterministic to augmented, which means that people were using the models just to do some smaller modifications. For example, you could look at a piece of information that's coming in, let's say emails, and you want to summarize that piece of information and send that somewhere. So the augmented capability came in, and we realized that most people just don't want to use GenAI model. It has to be as a combination of well-structured processes where you could augment the capabilities in that particular process with GenAI models here and there. And that's why we kind of thought about building the entire process capability where you could take and build deterministic flows and introduce AI agents wherever necessary. Now, obviously, things started improving. The models got better. Reasoning came into the picture. And what we started to do was we moved from augmented to semi-autonomous. What I mean by that is, typically when you have to do a logic, if-else statements, for example, something came in, you have to make a decision whether if this is above a certain threshold, you have to have a manual approval. If it's not, then you do an automatic approval, etc. That was predefined in the design process. When we started going into semi-autonomous capabilities, we started giving models the capability to make that decision based on certain business rules. We don't have to define at the design time. This moved the entire capability of our process augmentation and process automation from deterministic to augmented to semi-autonomous. So that was the third bit. Then we realized everything that we had worked on in terms of the process and Search AI, everything was behind the scenes. Whatever you built there was exposed as APIs that you could consume. But we realized there were a significant portion of employees within organizations who had to have access to things like ChatGPT, but were not allowed to use ChatGPT within their enterprises because of various restrictions. But they wanted to be able to interact with these capabilities like they would with ChatGPT. The expectation was it has to be as simple as that. So we started focusing on the entire capability of what we call AI for work, which is essentially your interface. Think about that as enterprise ChatGPT, very specifically built for the enterprises. using your own systems, your own background integrations, and bringing the data that is necessary so that you could not only do information retrieval, but you also could do a lot of different type of actions, such as you creating calendar invites, you being able to understand what's happening in a particular meeting, understand transcriptions of a particular meeting, transcribing that, probably translating that to various different languages, so on and so forth. These were very helpful, especially in global organizations. Now, once all of this was happening, we started to see the agentic capabilities grow substantially because, again, the models got stronger, the concept of tools came into the picture, structured responses came into the picture. So we had to figure out how do we actually bring all of these capabilities back again into the platform, and we started focusing on agentic-first architecture. This agentic-first essentially meant that we only have the models now, powerful models, that can have the capabilities of bringing in various different tools. It can make a decision based on what's happening at the runtime and then define which tool to be called, get the piece of information, and then obviously support the response from the users. Now, this was a simple model tool calling at the beginning. Then we moved into multi-agent orchestration, where you have an orchestrator model sitting on the top, which understands what the user's request is. Then it orchestrates that to various different sub-agents to get the stuff done, each one of them dedicated with certain kind of persona. And then you take this piece of information, the orchestrator would give the response back to the users. So we start thinking through agents, multi-agent orchestration, tools, reasoning and reflection, which is extremely critical because not only were we just asking the model to do something, we were asking it to do the planning, and the orchestrator agent was actually doing the planning and distributing that across various different sub-agents for it to execute on. So when we start thinking about all of this, we realize that for enterprises, there is a starting point that is required for you to be able to jumpstart these. Like the way I was talking about 60 plus templates in the prompt, we also start focusing on building industry solutions and marketplace for various different things. So we had extended the capability of the platform for 250 plus integrations with 9,000 actions within that. So you can tap into whether you want to Google Drive or HubSpot or STFC, etc. And you will be able to use this triggers or actions and then get the piece of information, make your agents to talk to them and get the piece of information for it to work on whatever the kind of optimization it's trying to do. So we've worked on various different industry templates, and we continue to grow this as we go along. Now, on one side, we saw all of this different capabilities being bundled up, and we said, okay, now you have the ability to construct something very special within your organization to optimize your process, probably rethink the process from the ground up. However, we also realized that if you let the agents go loose, if they let the models go loose, then probably there is some kind of governance you need to have in place. Because at the end of the day, all of these models are probabilistic in nature. That means you need to have an idea of what they are trying to do and understand if they're doing exactly what you expected to do during the prototyping phase and during the production phase. That's when we started thinking about this entire construct of evaluation. Now, this is something we've been spending a lot of time on, and we continue to grow on this. So if you think about it, evaluation comes in various different levels. We kind of call that as semantic, behavioral, and context. So I'll very briefly touch upon those. Semantic evaluation is essentially the model's ability to respond back for a given query. So we want to understand, for a given query, does the model always respond exactly the same way? What can we tweak to make that happen? Given the probabilistic nature, how do we ensure that we generate a lot of test cases to make that work? The second is the behavioral evaluation. When you go into the agentic concept, agents are not just a model responding anymore, but you are giving the models the ability for you to call tools external to the model itself. When it calls tools, first of all, we have to know if it's calling the right tool for the given context. Second, is it actually finding the right information to pass to the tool? And third, is it understanding the information that comes back from the tool, and is it using it appropriately? So thinking about this whole aspect was quite difficult, and we've been thinking about how to actually evaluate this. And that was the second part of the evaluation we've been thinking about. Third is the context-based evaluation. Now, typically, models, when you ask it to write a poetry, it does a phenomenal job, but in the enterprise, you don't want to do that. You actually want to send it information that is from your enterprise context. For example, you're probably pulling it from search within your enterprise systems. Now, when you give a particular context, how does the model behave? Does it respond back with its own information, or does it use your context to respond back? So that's the other part that we've been thinking about. And all of this has been quite challenging, and we've been working on how do we actually make this evaluation studio better and better. And right now, if you think about it, once you build these agents, how do you test it is a significant challenge, because what are all the different parameters through which you can actually test them? So we're working on this concept of simulations, which essentially says that if you have a particular agent, you can define the type of personas you want the agent to be tested on. So for example, if you build a banking agent, you can say, I want to actually test this on a persona of an 18-year-old to a persona of a 70-year-old, and basically use that as a basis for it to generate automatic test cases, go hit the agents how many ever times you want it, and then see how the responses come back. That entire simulation is something we are working on, which comes back to the whole concept of evaluation. So I don't know if you guys have heard this concept of test-driven development, which has been the common philosophy of software development lifecycle all through so far. And we believe going forward with Agentic, it's going to be evaluation-driven development. You start with evaluation tests, and you continue to build on top of it. So coming back to the slide that David put on, so all of this is the background with which this entire stack actually come to play, about 3 years in the making. Now, the point we kind of built all of this as components is because we want it to be model neutral or model agnostic, cloud agnostic, and the ability for you to pick and choose from the stack what makes sense to you. And then we build solutions on top of it for very, very different type of scenarios within your organization. Now, that's where we have actually taken, and I think the road ahead is quite complex for us, and we are trying to experiment on what's coming next as well. So one of the things when you start thinking about what's coming next is our beliefs. As we start looking at this, as we start seeing how we are evolving as an organization, is that we will have an organization that's going to be a combination of human employees and AI employees working together. This is going to be a standard very, very soon. Today, we already have access to the likes of ChatGPT or whatever the kind of copilot you're using, and every individual within an organization is using that for some reason or the other, but it's going to be much more of a standard governed structure that's going to sit on top of it. Organization that's going to be a combination of these two. Then you have to start thinking about how do you actually look at this organization from the ground up, and what do you need to do to make this kind of structure work in the future. And our focus has been on that. The first part is we are going to continue to innovate on the agents. Now, we have only talked about multi-agent orchestration in terms of the hierarchical. There are different type of modes and methods. For example, collaborative, complete responsibility being driven by one agent to another agent. So there are different type of architectures that we can actually think about for multi-agent orchestration, and we are focusing on making that happen. The second, and this is quite important, most enterprises already have systems and processes at play, and everybody keeps experimenting with various different things. So what we want to do, and the fundamental principle we work with, is everything we build has to coexist what the customers already have, which means interoperability is very, very important. And that's why we're extensively working on the SDKs for our agents, A2A compatibility, MCP compatibility, which essentially means that if you have any of the protocols adhere to anything you build within your organization, our agents and everything you build within Core can interoperate with those particular agents as well. Now, as David touched upon, we've been working with hyperscalers quite a bit because we know they pretty much most of the organizations that we work with will work with one of these hyperscalers behind the scenes. The days of on-prem is slowly fading away because of the need for the GPUs and the different kind of hardware right now. But whatever said and done, I think we are trying to integrate with these hyperscalers pretty deeply so that if you want to use any part of their ecosystem along with their ecosystem, it's a matter of plug and play of what makes sense to you. So that's one part where we are focusing on. The second is as you start evolving the agents across your organization, you don't want the agent to start from ground zero every time you invoke it. You have to have the ability for it to understand what has happened historically, not only with what you did, but what your team did, what your organization did, and how do you bring all of those pieces of information so that it can make sure the agent understand the history and the context of what is happening and how you can change that. So we're working on memory quite a bit right now. The basics of the memory are in place already within the tool. We're expanding on top of that. We want to continue to expand on the connectors. I talked about 250 plus connectors. We do have that. We're expanding to about 500 plus based on what we have seen. And we're also trying to extend this to specific kind of SDKs that you can extend the connectors if you want to within your organization, because we know not everything is available outside in the world where we can integrate with. Now, search AI intelligence, I talked about Agentic RAG. We're experimenting on Graph RAG, so many different ways for you to be able to ensure not only would you get the right information, but also you get the right information with lowest latency possible. Then finally, the key area for focus for the next 2 quarters for us is the governance of agents. So we are thinking about, if you start having the organization which will have AI employees and human employees working together, then you have to start thinking about a control tower which says, well, how do I know what agents are doing when I let them go into the wild? What each one of them are doing? Are they meeting their objectives? Are they failing in certain scenarios? And how do we ensure that if they're doing something they shouldn't, we stop them or we retrain them? And this entire concept of governance, where you can inject policies, and the policies are not determined at the design time, but actually the agents can learn from the policies in the runtime. If your regulation changes, you update the policies, agents reflect themselves. We believe that as we start thinking about agents, they should be able to self-optimize and self-heal. And that is the goal with which we are going. And for you to be able to self-optimize and self-heal, they have to understand your organization's policies. And that's where governance really comes into play. And we are focusing pretty much significantly on that. The other part is identity. So when you have multiple agents collaborating with each other, how do you know an agent can trust the other agent talking to each other? So if an agent says, I want this information to the other agent, then you have to share an identity as a handshake. Otherwise, you will not know if that agent is worthwhile trusty piece. Because as you start thinking about the growth of agents in an organization, similarly, the risk of that also significantly increases. So simple things like prompt injection exist today, but you will have more different type of hacks that will come into play. And again, governance focused on how do we ensure that these hacks are talked about, thought through, and then eliminated before you actually come and penetrate within your organization. Then finally, coming back to the concept of how do we ensure they self-optimize and self-heal, teachability becomes quite important. So how do we ensure that the model themselves, well, not really the model, the AI system, I want to say, because the model is doing what it is supposed to do, but the entire system around that is actually giving the information back to the model, and they also try to optimize, which means that we want to be able to make sure that teachability of these, whether it is a RAG system, whether it's an agent orchestration, they learn from their previous interactions and then approve. So for example, they may have a conversation, they realize something went wrong, it goes and updates the memory so that the context becomes different when they are interacting with the same individual or the same team the next time. And finally, we are significantly focused on improving on the industry solutions for very specific verticals. Again, making sure there is a starting point for everybody to build with and build on top of it as they go along, and so that you don't have to start from ground zero. So in summary, basically what I want to talk about is this. Right now, we are really innovating at the breakthrough pace, and this is important because things are changing very, very rapidly. By the time we start thinking about a particular feature that we want to build, things would have completely changed the market, and we're trying to retrofit that every day. So it's been a significant challenge for us, but it has also been a lot of fun in terms of making this happen. So our focus is that we will continue to really ensure that the breakthrough thinking happens, and innovation is completely focused on every aspect of the agentic capability we want to build in. Okay. The second part, and this has been already the challenge we've been addressing, and essentially comes back with our experience of building enterprise-ready products. Scale is not easy. Prototyping is easy. As the speaker earlier was talking about, scale is extremely hard. And we want to be able to build on the ability for us to be able to use the hyperscalers and whatever the technology we have behind the scenes, enable you to scale from 0 to 100 as quickly as possible. Okay. Not what I meant, but sure. And the final 2 slides basically is this. Our innovation is only as important as your adoption. And as we start looking at everything that you guys do as our customers, as innovators in the industry that you are in, we want to make sure that we provide you the right kind of tools to ensure that you accelerate that process. And for us and for you, it's been a learning journey together, because this is an era right now that things are changing at the same pace, that all of us are learning and innovating at the same space. So you guys are focusing on your industries, we are focusing on the tech, and we want to just bring in this together and make sure that platform supports you to wherever you want to go. At the same time, we learn from you and make sure we bring those back into the platform and ensure that that becomes as successful as we can for us and for you. With that, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate that, and looking forward to the rest of the evening.